This is Election 2020, New Mexico Senate District 31. I'm Fred Martino. KRWG Public Media and the League of Women Voters are pleased to present today's forum. The rules are simple. Candidates have up to 90 seconds to answer each question and should not mention their opponent in the answer. My co-host is League Co-President Eileen VanWie, and we welcome candidate Joseph Cervantes. We were unable to reach John Roberts. Joe, thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be with you and all your listeners.
All right, your first question. In what ways, Joe, if any, should the tax system in New Mexico be reformed? Explain.
We need a short-term and a long-term plan, like a lot of things in our state. The short term is we need to immediately eliminate a lot of tax credits and tax deductions that frankly are passed in the interests of special interest groups or special interest economic interests that are done in the name of economic development or any other reasons. But it's a special tax treatment that the rest of us don't get. We need to eliminate those so there's fairness, that we're all paying our fair share. That's what we do in the short term because we can do that, frankly, immediately. In the long term, we have to find a way that we have stable revenue, predictable revenue. In New Mexico, we don't. Right now, we're relying about 40% of our budget on oil and gas, and we've seen what happens when you put 40% of your revenue on one industry.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Eileen?
Joe, should New Mexico continue to tax Social Security benefits? And please explain.
Well, right now, we're not in a place where we can begin to try and eliminate a big revenue stream, although I'll tell you that the tax on Social Security benefits is probably a pretty small part of our revenue source. I think it'd be good for us to plan to eliminate that. But as we just talked about with Fred, we need the long-term and the short-term plan. I don't think that's going to happen in the coming session, but it should be a goal for maybe 3 years out so we can attract more individuals who want to come and retire in New Mexico, and we should be a favorable state for them.
Thank you, Joe. Moving on to another financial issue, starting pay for teachers is nearly 20% lower in New Mexico as compared to districts in El Paso, which start at more than $50,000 a year. How do you assess efforts to make the state's salaries more competitive?
Glad that you compared our salaries down here to El Paso, because unlike Albuquerque and Santa Fe and other places in the state, we have a competitive market that's 30 miles down the road. And so, of course, we spend a lot of our lifetime educating our young people through our public schools. We spend a lot of money and effort educating them through our colleges. And then, of course, they're quick to leave our state, and we have an out-migration of our best and our brightest and our most educated. And of course, it's natural they'd go work down the road, or in the case of my district, I represent Sunland Park and Anthony, in Chaparral. In the case of those individuals, they're driving to El Paso. It's closer than even coming to Las Cruces. So we have a very competitive market. I think that that's different, of course, in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, but I think that we need to recognize that teacher salaries should be geographically considerate of what the market demands of us down here, for one. The second thing, of course, is that we have to begin to try and have a greater respect for teaching as a profession. And so I'd like to see those salaries increase that compare with other professions. And in the same way, expect as much from teachers in return in terms of their education and the demands on them in terms of their time and workload with our students. And so we're asking a lot for teachers now, but we do need to get their salaries up. We want to attract the best to New Mexico, and that means paying at least what El Paso and Texas are paying.
All right, thank you.
Are you satisfied with how much money was allocated for the Early Childhood Trust Fund in the 2020 legislative session? And please explain.
We should be honest with folks. There really wasn't anything allocated at all. So if you're asking whether it was enough, it was a contingent allocation, and we very swiftly eliminated that allocation when we got into financial trouble. So the thinking of the money that was put into that fund back in February and March was a different New Mexico. It was a New Mexico that we thought was going to have revenues as far as the eye could see. So no, the answer is, was there enough money put into that? No, there wasn't. Should there be more? Yes. Is there money to do more now? The issue for us, we should always think about it this way. it's not a matter of more money or less money into that pot. The issue is going to be, what are our priorities? We only have so much money, we have so much revenue, we have so many expenditures, and will this be the priority? And that'll really be the question. It's not a up or down on anyone's spending. It's this or that. Really, it's a determination of priorities. And remember, again, about 60% of our budget is already set aside to education. About 25% is health and social services. So that's 85% that's already spoken for. There's not a lot more left to have a lot of discussion about.
All right, we're going to delve into that 25% you just mentioned. What actions do you support, if any, to improve the accessibility and quality of health care in New Mexico?
Well, you'll forgive me for getting outside of my lane a little bit on a state Senate level, but we've got to get support from the federal government and a commitment to healthcare. Right now, we're in that uncertain world where we don't know whether the Affordable Care Act is going to be gutted by future lawsuits and Supreme Court members. We don't know whether a future administration will continue to try and undermine the Affordable Care Act. But we should recognize, and we should talk about the fact New Mexico is a huge beneficiary of that Affordable Care Act. The number of New Mexicans who are now insured, who are not, means that those of us who are paying insurance are lessening our burden because we're not having to pay to cover the uninsured. Realize that New Mexico gets a match from the federal government. So if we put $1 into healthcare in New Mexico, the federal government matches that with a 3-to-1 match. So these are all federal initiatives that we need to continue to advocate for. And that really, Fred, is where we start, is protecting the federal partnership we have and not seeing efforts to undermine them.
Thank you.
Okay, Joe, what should the legislature do to improve the New Mexico economy and develop more job growth?
First of all, of course, everyone who I've served with in almost 20 years in the legislature, and every governor and every politician says the same thing, which is we have to expand the private sector and grow our private sector. The reality is most of them have not really been very successful at doing that, but I'm going to start there with you and say that that's the reality, is we have to get out of the notion that New Mexico is not a business-friendly state, and we have to attract that private investment in our state. There's ways to do that, particularly for those of us that are in southern New Mexico. If you look at what's going on down the road, particularly in the district I represent, El Paso is exploding. Cranes all over their downtown, high rises going up, massive investments. We've seen it in their freeway and highway systems. So we've got to get government involved in creating a business-friendly climate. And then we won't have all of our revenue tied up in one industry, which it is now, oil and gas.
Joe, do you favor the legalization of recreational marijuana in New Mexico? Explain.
I haven't, but that's because of the legislation that I've seen come across my desk. So, for example, this last session, I voted against the bill that was in front of us. And what the bill really did is did far more than legalize marijuana. It decided who was going to control the market. And that's my concern, is that the people that are pushing this are very frequently the ones who are trying to make sure that they control the marketplace, that they have a monopoly on who gets to grow it, who gets to sell it, and who gets to make, frankly, hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's what we have to recognize, that this is a big business, it's a big industry potential. I'm not comfortable with doing what we've done in alcohol, which is create a small little market for it, create business licenses for alcohol that are worth $1 million or so, simply because the government created a monopoly for that. And I haven't been comfortable with that.
Should it be legal in New Mexico for a physician to assist a patient in dying? And would you explain your answer?
Well, the way you phrase it, I would have to say yes. I believe that it is important for physicians to provide care in the latter stages of ill health, or an individual who has a condition that there is no hope for recovery and they're suffering or in pain. And I'll just tell you from my own experience and within my own family, we've sadly lost individuals in my family who have gone through long illness and suffering. And I'll tell you that doctors are already very good about doing this. They're very good about offering care in end stages of life to lessen pain and suffering and anxiety. I think a lot of that care is going on now, and we should recognize that, accept it, embrace it, and leave it to doctors who are professionals.
Thank you.
Joe, do you support any additional adjustments to current gun regulations? Explain.
Well, I've worked hard on this, and I'll start with saying that I am a gun owner, and I think it's important as a gun owner that we are the ones who take the lead in recognizing the importance of gun safety. I was raised on our family farm down near La Mesa here in the valley, and we grew up with guns as part of farming and ranching. It was a way of life, but we were taught very early the importance of respecting gun safety and realizing the responsibility that comes with gun ownership. So for that reason, I sponsored this last year and passed the red flag law, which I'm proud to say 60 Minutes just did a story on recently. It had a lot of support from law enforcement. So with the experience we have in El Paso this last year and the mass killings there are some responsible gun safety laws that we need to pass. And I think we've done a lot of that work already.
And Joe, should New Mexico promote renewable energy, and if so, how?
We should, of course, and we should do it by, first of all, being honest about what we're doing and not doing. So, for example, we talk oftentimes about renewable energy standards and percentages and so forth. Right now, we've already got a renewable standard for the year 2020 that, very frankly, we're not even meeting. So we pass these standards, whether we call it the Energy Transition Act or whatever we may call it. And frankly, when you look at those laws, there's no consequence to not meeting them. So we set these targets, but if there's no consequence to not meeting them, then frankly, they are at risk of being ignored. So we should pass meaningful standards that have consequences for not being met. That's the first place to start. The second place to start is here at New Mexico State University. I'd love to see NMSU become a national leader in renewable energy development, and we have everything here in our local community to make that happen. It is the future, and we should be leading.
Joe, what is the role of the state, if any, in abortion regulation?
That's going to be determined to some degree by the next Supreme Court. If Roe versus Wade is overturned, and some are concerned about that, then the abortion laws would revert back to each state, which is what it was before Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade essentially said there's a federal right under the Constitution to have access to pregnancy and reproductive rights. But if we turn it back to the states, then we're going to see every one of the 50 states having this debate and potentially having different laws in every part of those 50 states. And I don't think that that's going to be wise. I think we're going to find a great deal of differences between different states. And I favor something more like Roe versus Wade in a national constitutional recognition of that right.
Do you favor an open primary as a way for independents and decline to state voters to participate in primary elections? And explain, please.
It's a great question. We had this just this last June during the special session. There was a law passed, and frankly, it's the law in the books now. The law as of June of this year is that our primaries will be open in the future and that independents can come and participate in the Democrat or Republican primaries or decline to state or others, people that are not associated with primaries. I voted for this. I'll tell you that Jennifer and I have 3 daughters. They're all in their 20s. When you talk to them and you talk to their friends, I'll tell you most of them are very content being on the independent side of the political spectrum without aligning themselves with either party. And I think they should be participating in the process.
Thank you.
Joe, what would you change, if anything, about the current campaign finance law in New Mexico?
Well, I'd like to see it happen at the federal level and nationally, because very frankly, money is driving the entire political process. It's hard for candidates to run for office against people who have large war chests. It's next to impossible. You have a lot of special interest groups who are raising a lot of money, and very frankly, the special interest groups create issues. They create artificial issues precisely with the idea of raising money by trying to create these high-profile issues to do so. So we've got to get money out of the process. Our democracy is failing. It's not working. The partisanship is completely destroyed the democracy and any kind of civil debate. And the only way to get rid of that is to get money out of the process. So I favor public finance at the state level, and I'd like to see meaningful limits at the federal level.
The next question, Joe, is should we establish public financing for state elections? And if you would explain.
We should, and we have some of that. That's important to know now. For example, on this year's ballot, we have people running for Supreme Court. We have Justice Bacon, Justice Thompson, who are running for re-election. They are accepting of public financing. In other words, they're not running for judgeships and then out there raising money. I think that's a good thing. We've done it in other positions in the state. I think we should try and broaden that to really all elected offices in the state so that we can hear fresh voices and people that can run for office that either aren't millionaires themselves or frankly aren't beholden to special interests that will raise the money for them to make it happen. And that's unfortunately cut out a lot of voices and a lot of participation in politics today is the money.
Thank
Joe,
you.
this is sort of a follow-up on an earlier question that we had, but we'll give another up to 90 seconds for this. What actions would you support to create more stable revenue streams for state government?
The good tax policy means having a smaller rate of tax across a broader tax base. It's just like investing in the stock market or anything else. You want to diversify your tax base. You want to diversify your stocks. You don't want to put all your money in the stock market into one stock. So we need to create a diversity in our tax base. That means looking at property taxes in conjunction with income taxes and in conjunction with gross receipts taxes and lowering the rate, but spreading it across more areas. And so right now, I think we've been going the wrong direction, which is the thinking is that we can accomplish our tax revenue needs by more and more relying on a smaller group of people or a smaller group of businesses. Oil and gas is the good example of that. If you put all your eggs in that basket, which is what we've done, then when oil and gas prices collapse as they have, you've got no place to go. So we need to rely on a greater diversity, which is going to include income and property taxes and gross receipts across many more sectors of the economy than oil and gas.
Joe, would you please explain whether you do or do not support an amendment to the state constitution to compensate legislators for their service beyond the per diem amounts they now receive?
I haven't supported that in the past, but I think that that's inevitably in our future. I don't think the legislature should be the ones to take the initiative to do that. And so that's partly why I haven't tried to lead on that or vote for it. I think this has to come from the citizens. And so I have supported what we call a constitutional revision commission. Right now, our Constitution says legislators are not compensated. I think the citizens have to come together and decide that they want to make that change. And I recall years ago, Governor Carruthers, our local university president, former president, and former governor, took a good lead on that. And it was a bipartisan effort. And it's where New Mexico needs to go. We're the last state that doesn't provide any resources to the legislature at all. I have no staff, no offices. Everything that I do to do my job really comes out of my pocket.
Joe, would you support the establishment of a state bank in New Mexico? Explain.
There's only been one state bank ever created in history, North Dakota, I believe, in about 1919. Over a century ago. Common sense tells me that if it was working and it was a great idea, we would have had at least one other state in the last century adopt that model. So I haven't thought that that should be a priority of our state. Again, other states are doing very well economically, financially strong without having their own state bank. I don't know that North Dakota is the model for New Mexico. And I also believe that New Mexico has many challenges in front of us today: crime, drug use, alcoholism, poverty, education. We have a lot of things that are on our plate right now. I don't know, getting into the finance business and becoming a banking institution as a state is something that should be our priority right now.
Well, this next question relates to some of the conversation we've already had, but what alternate sources of funding can you envision to supplement gas tax revenues?
Once again, we need a short-term and a long-term perspective. So in the immediate future, we're going to have to look at what is available to us now and put it to its best use. The federal government has put a lot of money available to the local governments and to the state. We want to make sure we're using that smartly. to do job creation, to put projects out there that can be built now and putting people to work. But long term, we've got to be looking at things that are stable. Incomes is a relatively stable source compared to oil and gas, which is very volatile. Things like property taxes. New Mexico has the lowest property taxes in the country. It has for all the years I've been in the legislature. That's a good thing on one hand, but it also should make us realize that we can be looking at that as a revenue source. Property taxes are pretty stable. Property values generally don't have the volatility that incomes do or gross receipts do, which is gross receipts, of course, come up and come down as the economy and people spend money. So I would look more at things that are more consistent. That's going to include incomes, it's going to include property, and it's going to include gross receipts. And right now, we're putting all of our eggs into oil and gas.
Joe, discuss the extent to which the public should have a role in the redistricting process that will occur next year.
Our democracy is very sick, and it's ill. It's not working well for us. There are principally, in my mind, two reasons. One of them is the question, which is redistricting. Right now, if you look at the legislative races, I know you don't want me referring to an opponent, but I don't have an opponent here today, and I'm not referring to him by name, but most of these races are not competitive. There are very few of these legislative races that can be really competitive races, and it's done by design. And the same thing is true for Congress. The Congress people draw their own districts to try and ensure their reelection. And so we've got to make democracy healthy again by making these races competitive. That keeps people from doing what's happened, which is going to the extremes of the left, going to the extremes of the right. And that these days is generally what happens, is people run to the extremes so they can get reelected, and that's not working.
Would you discuss your perspective on private prisons and detention centers in New Mexico?
I think it's unfortunate that we have the private prisons as such an important part of our correction system today, principally because if you think about it, those private prison corporations, they're for profit, and they make the greater profit by keeping people in their beds full. So there's a disincentive for them to do what I'd like to do, which is have them retraining people, preparing them to re-enter society and be never coming back again. They need to keep people in prison. They need to have their beds full. And it seems very counterintuitive. So we've got to give those private prisons an incentive to train people, to keep them from coming back. And right now we have the opposite. The incentive for them is to keep people coming back and staying in their prisons. And that's not healthy for our state.
During the pandemic, a lot of people have been talking about and thinking about our next question, and that is, what role should government play, if any, in providing an affordable internet connection to all New Mexico residents?
It's a great question, and it's probably one of our first priorities. So I've talked today with you about long-term and short-term priorities. One of our short-term priorities would be taking the federal money that's being made available to us and putting that into broadband and internet access, because you're right, we're increasingly relying on that, as we are even today for our debate. This is the first time we're not in your studios. We're doing this from your offices and mine. I'm conducting my business as a lawyer and a businessman from my computer. Teachers and students are relying on that. And those of us that are doing that every day know some people have good connections and some people have bad connections. And when we don't have good connections, we have students and teachers who are getting left behind. And we have businesses that are suffering and being left behind. The solution to that is putting a huge investment into internet access in our state.
Joe, how can government better identify and prioritize infrastructure projects?
It's a great question once again, and it's one that we understand what's going on. We have at times as much as $1 billion. Let me put that in perspective for a minute. Our state budget, everything we spend together, has been hovering around $7.5 billion. That's our whole state budget. About $1 billion is committed and bonded and appropriated for projects that are stalled, that aren't happening, that are just sitting. And that's a poor use of our money. We're paying interest on those bonds. So what happens is we're approving and funding projects that aren't ready. And so to reform our capital outlay process, I've sponsored legislation over the years to try and ensure that we're funding projects that are ready to go. that we're not doing it in pieces, that we're not partially funding projects with the idea of funding a little bit of it each year, because by the time we have enough money put together to do the project, the prices have changed and the need for the project has changed. So we need a complete overhaul of the way we do that capital outlay funding in our state. We're ranked the worst in the country consistently. And every year we say we're going to do it, and there's rarely the will in the legislature to do so.
Okay, well, we are out of time. It was a great program with lots of different topics, and we do appreciate you for joining us. Thank you so much. Joe Cervantes, running for re-election in District 31 for the New Mexico Senate.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
And thank you to Eileen VanWie, my co-host, and for all of you at home for making public media possible. I'm Fred Martino. Have a good week.